Hello and welcome to BMA Violet Hour. My name is Tracy Beal. I'm the manager of public programs here at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And tonight we are featuring a conversation with conceptual artist Stephanie Syjuco. She will be in conversation with cultural curator and artist Savannah Wood. That conversation is inspired by the exhibition that's currently on view at the BMA. It's called Stephanie Syjuco, Vanishing Point Overlay. So before we get into the talk, we're going to hear from the exhibition's curators. They are both associate curators of contemporary art at the BMA. They're our newest members of the curatorial team, and it's their first time on BMA Violet Hour. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Jessica Bell Brown and Leila Grothe. Hi.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Tracy. Leila and I are very excited to walk you through artist Stephanie Syjuco's brilliant installation at the BMA, Vanishing Point Overlay. With this show, Syjuco asks how we might shift our perspective to reckon with our understanding of America's past and its continued effects on our troubled present. This fantastic show is up until May 16th. And without further ado, we can go ahead and start the video. Approaching the museum outside, visitors will encounter to the person sitting in darkness a flag conceived by Mark Twain in 1901, which replaces white stripes with black ones and the stars with skulls and crossbones. Stephanie resurfaces this flag, which was never actually produced in Twain's lifetime, but served as a critique of American colonial intervention in the Philippines.
Greeting visitors as they enter the second floor galleries is the Vanishing Point series, which are the title works for the exhibition. By incorporating BMA sculptures into her installations, this marks Suguko's first time staging a collection intervention at any institution. Interested in complicating how we talk about white supremacy within the museum, Suguko has culled our holdings of the 19th century American figurative sculpture to create Vanishing Point Overlay.
In the John Waters Rotunda, 20 fictional flags extend from the ceiling in the installation Rogue States. With sight lines that extend into the European wing and the main entrance, these flags appear to celebrate a global gathering evocative of a United Nations convention or an international conference. But closer inspection reveals them to be flags of fictional countries, ones that Suguko has culled from movies and popular cultures with problematic representations of non-Western cultures. From Hollywood blockbusters to comedy television shows, represented here are invented rogue states that have been portrayed as terrorists, backward, or unstable. And these caricatures function to position Western nations as heroic protagonists in a simplistic narrative of good and evil.
Suguko's work has long considered the visible effects of white supremacy and Western imperialism in American culture. These forces are continuous, rooted in the foundational history of America and driven by a need to sustain power. White supremacy is so embedded in our institutions, our structures, and our objects that it can be difficult for some to recognize. Suguko has seized the discursive space of the object label, choosing to blur key identifying details except for the museum's object numbers. The artist has chosen to leave these figures unnamed and drapes the busts to dismantle the symbolic power of important figures complicit in troublesome moments of our nation's history, from a founding father to a Confederate officer. So I'd like to now introduce you to Stephanie Syjuco and cultural curator Savannah Wood, who is the archives director for the Afro-American newspaper. Their bios are impressive, and we want to save room for their discussion, which will also be impressive. So we're linking to their accomplishments in the chat. So please take it away, Savannah and Stephanie.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. It's good to be with you, Savannah.
It's really great to be here too. And I just want to say thanks to everybody at the Baltimore Museum of Art, the organizers of this event, and Leila and Jess for bringing us together, because there's a lot of synergy between the work that we're doing, and I'm really excited to talk to you about your projects. So I guess I'll start sharing my screen now. We have some slides that we're going to share with you all tonight. Give me just a moment. And then we can get started here. So some of the things that I wanted to talk about is sort of like overarching themes, and Stephanie, feel free to add to this if you want to, but some of the themes that I think about when I'm looking at your work are visibility and obscurity, how that relates to authorship, surveillance, inclusion, and also like obscuring things without necessarily erasing them. So that's sort of like one thing that I want to make sure that we talk about tonight. And then another is how meaning is made and how power is reinforced through structural means. And so we'll talk a bit about how things are named, why and how photographs travel, codes, rules, symbols, standards, and things like that that are kind of adopted as the norm, that are the invisible infrastructure, as Leila was saying, of white supremacy, basically.
Yeah.
So if there's anything else you want to add to that too, we can put it at the top and then get into it, go through these slides. But
I think that's really rich. And also, I think what's great is that we're going to also get a chance to intersect our work and projects too, which is lovely. So
yeah, it's exciting. So in this, I know there was a bit of an intro. We got the video and everything. We're walking through the European wings to get to this installation here. And there's a recent Be More Art article about your work at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And the author wrote something to the effect of the subject of the dream is the dreamer. And I thought that was a really nice summation of kind of how we get into this room and what these flags are about. Can you share a little bit just about this project and your conception of it, and if it's changed at all in the different ways that you've presented it in other institutions?
Sure. Yeah. So what we're looking at here is actually sort of an overlap of two projects. So at the very top are this set of, I guess, fictional flags, which, is the project Rogue States. And I was really interested in hanging them in the rotunda because there's a kind of regalness, right, to the museum space. It actually automatically commands a kind of like formal attention. You sort of also assume that any space or architectural, arrangement that looks like this is about power. So, as you travel through the rest of the galleries to get to this, you're kind of passing through all these icons of art history, of, depictions of, Western civilization and, all its kind of accessory connections. And then you get to this place, and I wanted it to be curious because all of a sudden you're confronted with, busts of individuals which are actually covered in a kind of sheer fabric. And then this, odd display of maybe nationalism or unity, who knows?
Yeah, and the colors are so jarring too, because you come through and there's some of these more muted palettes walking through with the oil paintings and some of the sculptures that are in the other wings. And then you come in and just the colors that are used to symbolize non-Western, in a very specific way. I found that to be so interesting coming into this space. And before you even get in there, depending on how you access the museum, I suppose, but the way that I came in, this was actually my first encounter with your work coming into the space. And I thought that this was just so sharp because of the way that you're kind of obscuring this other symbol of power, which is this bust. And again, Leila and Jess refer to this to some degree in their intro. But I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what it means to you to cover these with this drape. And while you're obscuring it, you're not erasing it. So you're actually kind of pointing to this thing and making us look at it in a different way. And I think that's similar in the way that you handle the title card that's on here as well. Can you just talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So the viewer notices, I guess, what they could kind of recognize as statues or busts. And these are, pretty typical, I think, classical forms that one might find in a museum, specifically, a history museum. So usually, they commemorate individuals or, people that are somehow deemed important enough to occupy that space. And so I worked with the curators to actually cull through the American 19th century collection to look for statues and individuals that were actually associated with some forms of white supremacy, in the sense that that wasn't necessarily what they were known for as a kind of forward-leaning description, but it was embedded in their entire way of life. And so in kind of representing them, but also not re-platforming them.
Right.
The challenge was, how do you do that? How do you kind of expose these, individuals, but also, I guess, the broader notion that a lot of things have really dubious histories that we don't talk about. And so, I decided, I worked with the curators to bring them forward, but to cover them in this sheer drapery so you can kind of barely make them out. And then the wall labels for them are very similar to what you would find in, a normal wall label, except I physically had the name of the individual depicted blurred out. So, a mix of a kind of erasure, in an attempt to kind of maybe tamp down what they symbolize, or, to muffle, some of the hidden influences or power they might have had historically. And these were all Baltimore figures, actually. So, they're probably familiar enough for those that would want to do the research on them.
Sure. And something that I thought was really interesting about that also is you're taking their identity away from them. So there's these other alternate titles of, founding father, collaborator, Confederate, sympathizer, secessionist, and those sort of become these stand-ins for these individual humans. So in a similar way that colonial archives, let's say, take images of their subjects and reduce them to like farm woman, washerwoman, now we have native. Yeah, exactly. We have this flip of now these people are becoming these more one-dimensional figures through your interventions here. I wanted to ask you also, on this label in particular, we still have the name of the artist, and we still have this was a bequest of Mrs. Winfield Henry. And so how did you determine what names would stay on the label and which ones were coming off?
Yeah, well, again, it was to kind of point out that, erasing the entire thing actually doesn't show the whole, the inclusion of the work formally into the museum's collection.
Right.
So leaving out, the kind of the didactics essentially of the institution, whether that's the acquisition numbers or, even the dimensions and the artists, it was to kind of still point that, this object has a home in the museum. And it actually is, because it is in the collection, because it is considered art, it must be stewarded still, which is, kind of interesting, right?
Yeah, it's labor intensive, it's resource intensive, and it becomes something that's really cared for on the backside of the museum. I thought it was interesting also that you left the artist's name there, because it really points to this sense of authorship also of it's sort of like the supporting structures for these white supremacist systems also, and how these other names that are on the label bolster this idea, whether directly or not, but they're still involved in the process. I wanted to include this image also. I did a walkthrough with Leila and Jess, and they pointed out to me that some of these flags are also obscuring the names of donors to the museum. And so in a certain way, you're just like covering up all these other layers. And now this is the John Waters Rotunda, but it was not always called that. But it's also just, this pointing out the architecture and the ways that people, the vanity of having your name on a building, and then just back on that again. We're like, no. I wanted to talk about an older work of yours also. It's not that much older, but very different in the way that you're using a similar fabric. So there's this sheer fabric that you're draping over human figures, whether it's a live person in the image on the left or this statue on the right. And the fabric refers back to like the clear background on Photoshop. So the checker box clear background on Photoshop, which again is like kind of interrogating the structures of how we make things, how we make meaning. But I wanted you to talk a bit about the similarities and differences between these two works, and maybe give a little bit of context also for the image on the left, which is not included in the BMA show, but is from a separate show.
Yeah. So if you were to see the covered statues in real life, you'll also notice that there's this interesting kind of gray and white checkerboard pattern. And, it's the pattern you could assume is just to sort of, obscure the figure, but it actually does refer to the digital post-production technique in Photoshop, where the very, very last layer of what you're manipulating digitally, it's supposed to not be there. It's like the transparency layer in the very back, but it does have this like very visible checkerboard pattern. So I've been using that as a kind of metaphor for hidden systems of power, as well as what we kind of choose not to see, but is actually highly visible. So The image on the left is actually, I would say, an early kind of thought process around this. And it's a photograph of an individual who is undocumented. And I was working with her to create a portrait. This was in 2017, right when the massive anti-immigration bills were being passed from the previous presidential administration. And a lot of people's lives were upended with this possibility of removal. And so in order to create this portrait, to both shield her and also to kind of talk about this notion of her potentially being removed and kind of vanishing, in a sense, from, you know, the possibility of even becoming a citizen or staying in the country, I draped her with this sheer fabric and photographed her. And, you know, it really was a kind of, at the time, I think it was maybe a defensive gesture I was putting out there, both of protecting her and shielding her from being identified. And then on the right-hand side, though, 4 years later, I'm thinking about the offensive, right? By that I mean, so instead of thinking of shielding, I'm thinking of actively removing and just actively intervening to remove things, or, you know, to call out things that have just embedded themselves completely in our visible landscape.
Right. Yeah, there's so much about visibility, countervisuality in these images that I find to be really exciting. Just the idea of the image on the left in particular, that we don't want to hide our full selves. You know, you want to be able to document this person who has a significant life, who's here, who's embedded in the country, but then there's this protective layer of shielding from surveillance. And it's something that comes up in your work frequently, where you're removing the gaze, or removing the ability for people to look at a subject, but still representing the fact that this subject exists. And I think that's a really charged and important aspect that comes up in a lot of your work. So, and with that in mind, I wanted to talk about this series of portraits that you've made, which maybe I'll just ask you to explain it, actually, and then we can talk a little bit more about it.
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks for linking this in. This work is actually in an exhibition in San Francisco right now. So it's not at the Baltimore Museum, but it is related to, and, you know, obviously in a kind of visual way, right? Like through this kind of pixelated or, you know, digital hazy image. But the image on the left, these are actually portraits. It's from a series of portraits of Filipinos who were brought over to the United States back in 1906 to perform in the World's Fair in St. Louis. So at the time, the Philippines was a US colony, and that's actually something that is sort of lost, you know, in terms of people's historical knowledge. And so by rephotographing these tiny, tiny images that I found of these individuals in a tourist pamphlet, I blew them up to, you know, literally life size. So if you were standing in front of it, it looks like the size of your head. And the pixelation is just part of the digital process of taking such a tiny image and bringing it forward. But I really appreciated the reference it has also to maybe images you would see in a surveillance camera, or, you know, a kind of more contemporary image. But at the same time, it's also kind of looking back at you, you know, so 100 years after that image of this person was taken in a kind of ethnographic display, they actually get to, you know, come back into the world and then look back at the looker. Yeah. And, you know, it's a kind of catch-22, right? Like for me, it's both, you know, talking about how they were, in a sense, captured 100 years ago, and also how, you know, maybe they can be given a little bit of agency in some way.
And these were all hung at your approximation of what that person's height would be also, right? So in a way, it's also like this giving them a certain subjectivity too, where there's differentiation in height. There's, you know, an individual pulled out of a crowd photograph. And yeah, this confrontation that can happen even with a pixelated image moving through the space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with all of those ideas in mind, and with this sort of denial of the gaze, I also wanted to talk about these after images that you've made, because I think they do something different but similar. And if you could just talk a bit about the process and what we're seeing.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things about speaking with you too is that, you've jumped so much into archives in your own work. And so for me, this is definitely an exploration in the archives. And working both in the Missouri Historical Society when I was researching the St. Louis World's Fair exhibition, which again had imported these Filipinos to be put on display. And just finding like a lot of images, and a lot of them were obviously very problematic because they reflect an actual historical event, right, of putting people on display. And so just trying to kind of intervene in some way. And this was literally by, rephotographing the images, using printmaking to, print them onto like a soft paper and then crumpling them. And so there's a whole series of these works because what I'm intending on doing is also to deflect that kind of totalizing gaze, like the white supremacist gaze, the way of looking at things in a way that really just conscripts, Black and brown folks into these categories.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the categories that we were talking about earlier too, it's like native, like that are just so flattening. And there's so much to do in terms of renaming and reshaping what that gaze can be and how these objects move, how these images move through the world. And so I think this intervention really does that, shifts the way that we look at it, shifts the way that we look at the history of it, and makes us really question the structures that allowed this to come to be to begin with, and the archives that these things have lived in.
Yeah.
How did these things come to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a person of color, an immigrant to the United States and now a naturalized citizen, if I search for any images or depictions of, my own culture in the American archive, it's usually incredibly skewed and incredibly, one directional in terms of how people of color are depicted. So just grappling, trying to think through some of how to handle the archives.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, that's a kind of a perfect segue into the work that I've been doing with the Afro archives. And this photograph is like one very small portion of our full collection. But when I think about what we're working with, we have a sort of different kind of obscurity. We have all of these images that are in many ways trapped in boxes because we don't necessarily have the tools to bring them out yet. And so thinking about the fact that this is a collection that was compiled by Black people for Black people shifts the way that we might engage with it also. So when you're talking about searching for images as a person of color in America of your own culture reflected, there is often a really strong white supremacist bias overlaid onto those images. And within this collection, we have, obviously there are some things that show up, like there's some issues within the collection in terms of naming and things like that. But ultimately it's a really amazing because we have this opportunity to tell our own story. And for folks who are watching who might not know, the Afro was founded in Baltimore in 1892 and is the longest continually operating Black family-owned newspaper. I have to say like all those things. Family-owned newspaper in the country. In order to get it accurate, I have to say all those things. And so we've been collecting the materials that are part of the production of the newspaper basically since the inception of the paper. So there's a huge amount of content that's within this collection. And I was mentioning, it's like we're really telling the story from our perspective. And when we talked earlier, we talked about, notions of authorship and objectivity and the ways that certain papers project objectivity when we all know that there's biases built into every single thing that exists, and how for our newspaper in particular, being a Black paper that's situated in a white society, we don't have the luxury or the delusion to consider the fact that it would be objective. It's always from a subjective point of view. And so I included this image on the left because I just think it's hysterical. Like, what other newspaper would print, "Amen, Nixon resigns, so let it be, amen," And then on the right, there's this itinerary from a freedom ride. So it's like literally telling your own story from the inside and having a particular kind of access to our own history. But it's always told from our perspective. You know, it's like it very rarely centers whiteness, which I think is super important. But it also talks about how our complicated relationship to whiteness. And so I include this image in particular. These are, you know, this is Gold Star mothers. So these are mothers who lost their children in war, and it's all Black women whose children died for this country that has been so horrible to us for so long. And so it's always this complicated relationship that's being depicted within these archives. And moving from those flags waving, I wanted to jump into your flag waving outside of BMA and to talk a bit about the context for this piece. And I know it was originally kind of site specifically conceived also. And so if you could talk a bit about that and how it might have changed in your installation in Baltimore.
Yeah. So, so this is flying outside of the museum. And originally it was done in 2019 for the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And the reason that was site specific was, again, because, the Filipino display that, I had made the previous works for had taken place in St. Louis. I was doing research on the history, and it turns out that Mark Twain, who is a beloved Missourian, has deep roots in St. Louis as well, and had designed or talked about a new design for a flag. And Mark Twain was a pretty famous anti-imperialist. So during the U.S. takeover of the Philippines, he wrote this essay called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," which was a kind of satirical essay critiquing American involvement in this notion of, uplifting these brown people from overseas. And he actually proposed for the Philippines this flag. So it is an American flag and it's modified, but he suggested that for the Philippines, it should have black stripes and with the stars replaced by skull and crossbones. And that was obviously, to kind of show a more kind of violent, interaction between the two countries. That made sense in St. Louis. And it was interesting because, now placing it in front of the BMA, it went up about as we were putting it up or thinking of putting it up, the insurrection happened at the Capitol. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating to also see, people's, just the relationships of the flag, right?
Yeah.
Just in recent years, and then also how it kind of ebbs and flows into, more sort of like nationalist or white supremacist or patriotic or, all these weird different sorts of feelings people have of it. So it's pretty open-ended in the sense that it flies out there and it's the first thing, you see it without necessarily knowing that It was actually designed by one of America's most famous writers, hometown, kind of person, because it could be read as a critique, obviously, of the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard you've gotten some feedback from folks who have driven by or walked by and weren't happy about it. Have you heard any of those things?
Well, I think that it was related that, people were, some folks related they were troubled by it. But it was a little unclear as to what was troubling, by it. So again, I totally understand that there's a certain amount of it that's open to interpretation, but I do link it back to actually trying to talk about its historical roots, as well as its potential contemporary relevance.
Right. And there's so many specific rules and regulations around how flags are flown. Period. There's a whole flag code about how things can be flown, where, what comes first, what needs to be what size. And I find that to be really interesting just in the way that it, codifies this symbolism. That's the symbol of power, the symbol of America. And something I was thinking about when I saw this was that, situated in Baltimore, it takes on another meaning also just because this is, the home of the Star-Spangled Banner also, so thinking about that flag and thinking about the way in which that song is like, you know, the patriotic song, our national anthem, you know, and how all of that kind of ties back into this place and the controversies around that song. And so there's just so many layers to how this can be read depending on where it's installed. And I think in Baltimore, with its proximity to DC, with the timing of the insurrection, with our history with the flag, it's really rich. And then, of course, the other commentaries that you're making about the U.S. involvement in the Philippines and, you know, how little people actually know about that. You know, so it's sort of like, so it's kind of interesting to like stake this Philippine flag on U.S. soil too.
Yeah, that never existed and was actually designed by,
Well,
years ago,
designed by an American writer. Yes, of course. But I wanted to just bring up this image of the original Star-Spangled Banner, because I thought it was really interesting that there are so many intense feelings around how the flag is shown and represented. But this flag, people who witnessed the War of 1812 actually cut pieces of this flag to take as souvenirs, and so it's just kind of like irrational the way that people ascribe value to certain things, in my opinion. You know, it's like they want to own this piece of history, but they're desecrating the flag in the way that they're doing it. So this is the flag at the Smithsonian Institution. And I brought this image back up just to, you know, with that in mind, with these structures, these underlying structures that are these invisible rules that we have. This really points to the structure behind making meaning and making power felt in the way that it's installed. So I wanted to talk a bit about your project Added Value tonight also. Is when I saw this image for the first time, I saw some echoes to some other work that I'd made, so I'll get into that a little bit later. But if you could tell us a little bit about this project and the labels that are on here and the ways that you were kind of reframing meaning making and value through this work.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're sharing this, because it does tie into this notion too of like how we organize or think about knowledge or structures that then go on to create power hierarchies. So this was a project through the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art back in, I guess, 2018 now. Added Value functioned as a used bookstore. So you walked in there and you could literally buy, used books for anywhere from about $2 to $5, super affordable. But as you started to sift through them, you would encounter these very odd organizing categories. So, instead of like your normal section, like say history or Western civilization, all of a sudden you see, these sort of genres, like how we learn to see ourselves through the lens of whiteness, when your culture becomes a trend, and white women discovering themselves amongst the other. And I'm really proud to have done this project actually with two, in collaboration, with two other critical artist collectives who I had invited to also help me create the catalogs or create the categories, and then also put the books into those categories. And so it's basically like taking an existing used bookstore, reshuffling everything, and creating this radical new hierarchy or structure for it to the public to really talk about an alternative way of cataloging the same knowledge. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's through a BIPOC perspective. It's through one that opens up instead of like closes down what some of these categories could be.
Right. Yeah, I found this super inspiring. I working on this project to digitize the majority of the photographs in the Afro's archives. And so thinking about just the metadata that'll be a part of that project and the folder headings that already exist and how we can kind of shift the language that's in there. I think I mentioned to you before, I worked on a project that was all about Black women suffragists in Baltimore and DC, and we were in the archives pulling information from there in order to build this project out. But I kept not being able to find people, not being able to find these women. And I realized at some point that they were cataloged under their husbands' names. And so it was just like this small detail that really rendered them invisible in the archive, And so rethinking how do we organize these things? How do we use the tools at our disposal to create more expansive categories that can hold people at their multiple intersections, that can, hold information within different buckets, so as it is right now, everything is so hyper organized that it's segregated from the other information that complements it, that rounds it out, that gives it true meaning. And so I'm super inspired by these labels and the way that the labels shift the meaning of the books that fall under them. Absolutely. Or have the potential to do that.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I loved were these pairings that you made that that force people to really think about the ways in which knowledge is produced, how truth is made. And we often look at books as authorities on subjects. And so to place two conflicting authorities next to each other is super powerful. So if you could just talk about the pairings a bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, like these are considered low value books. These are books that are donated. They were donated to the San Francisco Public Library to actually sell in the bookstore. And it turns out there's a number of titles that there's just too many of them. And Bill Gates's The Road Ahead and Collapse, it turns out, are, some of those very popular, almost throwaway titles now. Mm-hmm. And so I was taking these low value books and then shrink wrapping them together as a pair. So this is actually a shot of the two books before they've been like bound together. And so you're forced to buy the pair as if, kind of bookends to each other, where, it appears to then like question this notion of both progress and also, both technological advancement and, the kind of hierarchy of, of expansion or growth.
Yeah. I love this one too.
Yeah.
Particularly in the way, like Before the Mayflower is also doing this work of revising the, the overarching story of America, the one that we're taught every day. And Before the Mayflower is already doing that work, but to pair the two together, you're like, you have to get it. You have to read it. We're not going to talk about Christopher Columbus without,
Yeah. And I think that the interesting thing too is, so, observing the patrons, it's like there was such delight over this, I think, recognition, like to see yourself or your concerns or even just your own kind of, structure of reality reflected in, a bookstore, or not even a bookstore, but whatever this project was.
Right.
It would be amazing to see your entire life restructured that way,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to include this project, first of all, because I think it's great, but also this was one of the first things that I saw where I was like, oh, wait a minute. We're doing, so like I saw your logo and I was like, this is just weird. So I did a project in Chicago called Black Ink Book Exchange in 2014, I think it was. And my idea was basically like, I'm sick of like having everything relegated to the Black section in the bookstore. So I just want to have a completely like by or about Black people bookstore. That would be a full exchange library. And so it's up in several places throughout Chicago over a summer and some change. And it kind of became like what you're talking about, like people being excited about seeing their concerns reflected. I mean, it sort of became a way to see what neighborhoods we're interested in, like as a whole. So people would come in and bring a book and take a book. So it was a very simple one-to-one exchange. No book was, well, it's not exactly true. I was gonna say no book had a higher value than others, but there were some books that were listed as like reference books, which were the more expensive like art books, so that anybody could come and sit and peruse them. But it also brought up this question of like, well, what is a Black book? So I got, and speaking of like several books, I got like 5 of The Help. And I'm like, you guys, I don't know if that one counts, It was kind of interesting just to see, some of it was books that people wanted to get rid of, and other people were really interested in, or like a book club would come in and be like, oh, there's 3 of these. Great. I can take 3 and like, we can read this together. But yeah, for me, that was a little hard. And then there was also some workshops that would, give a different life to books. So for instance, we had Jamila here did a songwriting workshop where we would pull a book off the shelf, open it up, pick the first line, and that would be the first line of the song, and just different ways to kind of work with these materials. Okay. And I'm like, I put all these together, and now when I pull them up, I'm like, oh, what was my connector for that one? But I love this work.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to jump into it because I think it does tie again into the the archive for one, because what we're looking at is a selection of re-photographed documents. This in particular was shot in the anthropology department at the Smithsonian. So I was lucky enough to get a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship right before COVID, kind of shut everything down. So I've been spending a lot of time in the anthropology archives looking at documents and photographs of, people from the Philippines. And again, noticing, the incredibly, anthropologic and xenophobic gaze. And so when looking at the documents, though, instead of representing them somehow as evidence, I decided to photograph it so that whenever I found an error or like a markup in the document, I shot it so that it was in the direct center. And so it's a collection of kind of mistakes, and to try to talk about this idea too, that, our national archives are not at all necessarily a reflection of, either all the stories or the actual story, really. That it has errors, omissions, corrections, all the things that actually reflect, the very, the human biases, really, of the time. So, again, like the question, for me, and I think it's because I've been so buried in national archives, and, they're not archives made by the community themselves, who are being, who are being sort of like saved for posterity. It really is, from the outside. So, I think this piece it just shows the documents, just straight up like this.
Yeah, I think super powerful. And it also, even if you are working with a collection that's created by the community, I mean, this is a project that I worked on, I think 2019, and just took a few photographs from the Afro archives and sort of recropped them. So this is an image that's outside of the Afro headquarters when George McGovern, who was a presidential hopeful, came to visit. And so it's a really big deal that this presidential candidate came to the Afro headquarters in 1972. And so they knew this, and so they kind of seized on this. So there's 3 images in the series, and this is like the main frame, basically. This one's a crop in, and you probably can't see it so clearly on your screen right now, but these are like bags, camera straps. But then here, there's like this little outline that somebody drew into the photograph, which I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And so many of the photos in the collection have these little, like, what I kind of call analog Photoshop. Just like, oh, this photo's blown out. How can we make this, pop, basically, for reproduction in the paper? So there's the notions of the actual reproduction, like the tools of making the thing is a factor in what's happening in these edits. But then there's also this, where if you look really closely, you can tell that somebody used whiteout to or paint or something to write Afro on the building. And for me, this is like, this is kind of, where do you draw the line, between fact and fiction? Is this communicating something that's truer, that we were at the Afro building, but that's not what the building looked like, So I just thought it was really just something to focus in on about that really kind of points to, again, the dream is the subject of the dream is the dreamer. It's like points to what the mindset was for the folks who are producing this. Or it's like, yes, we need to make sure that our stature is understood within the larger world, that they came to us to get our approval, to get our cosign, and the way that the company was positioning itself during this time.
Yeah, I mean, it was a factually correct event, but in order to make it more legible, right? Without words, without captions, without anything, it's sort of like the reality had to be enhanced just to make sure, so that there's no mistaking. Yeah.
All right, we're nearing the end of our time and the end of the slideshow, but I think we're in a good spot. So these last few slides are sort of the ways that I find that some of our work echoes each other. And so we saw some of these edits, these strategic crops that are highlighting certain portions of archival documents that are meant to convey a certain level of truth, but kind of unearth these mistakes that are also in there, or these additions or these edits. And in this, I'm also really curious about the ways that you're using layering. And I know there's very specific history behind these two images that are stacked on top of each other. So if you want to share a little bit about that, we can talk about that too.
Yeah, just really quickly. So, the time spent in the archives, it's kind of limited, actually. Like you have to go in, have a camera with you, can't really bring in anything. And so as I'm sifting through it, and I'm making work, like as I'm there, and usually that's by covering things, layering, kind of visually cropping or editing. And so here's a shot of me, literally holding two photographs together. The top image is a photograph of the photographer, the white woman photographer, who took the photograph of the Filipina native underneath it. And so I kind of wanted to make that very apparent in the sense that, the image was completely constructed, and I'm implicating them both in the construction of that image.
It's beautiful. In a parallel but different method of layering, this is an image that I made last year that all this work is about the Afro. Y'all, I've been deep in it. But it's an image of my great grandmother, who's basically one of the founders of the newspaper. Her father, who she inherited land from, and the former Afro building is under here also. So for me, this is sort of about, like, in a similar way, stacking these legacies, these people, these ideas together to form new relationships between them. And that's that.
Well, there's also, so if I can just add too, I mean, literally the way archives work is that you have photos and documents just like pressed against each other.
Yeah.
And in a way, even these transparencies of, the overlay is a kind of physical metaphor for how those things live together.
Absolutely.
They almost like they blend in, they meld, they touch, literally.
Yeah, and depending on how you're moving through things, it's like there's all of these new relationships that are formed just by the sequencing of how things are there. And so, yeah, the material is, like, the happenstance part of the material is also really rich.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so last two images we'll end on. And this one, again, I'm not sure that the reproduction will be super great for folks watching from home, but can you just share a little bit about this image?
Yeah, sure. So this was about, this is I guess a double portrait, and it's my shadow cast in the archives of the Smithsonian as I'm photographing a ethnographic image of a Filipino that was taken over 100 years ago. So in real life, you would actually be able to see a little bit of a face kind of popping out because it's being covered in glassine. So, a kind of sheer piece of paper. And so I wanted to implicate myself in the discovery or, the re-excavation of this archive. And then also have, the shadow cast, I guess, of, the 100-year gap between myself and this individual.
Absolutely. And then this is the last image, which is my own shadow cast across another ancestor's face. And what I like about both of these also is that they're taken in situ. So it's really about, like, the physicality of being with these materials, and the metaphorical layering, the metaphorical proximity of history through this, through touching all of these materials. But also, you're just literally there with them. You're just there with them.
Not Photoshop, just,
right.
Very physical.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure we get some audience questions in, if there are some. So I think Tracy was going to help us out with that.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation.
It's been so fun.
That conversation has easily another hour in it. I forgot that we were supposed to have a Q&A. I'm just sitting here.
Savannah's amazing. I mean, the connections that you're able to pull through the work, and actually the serendipity, that's like the craziest thing, the echoes between different bodies of work and the connections. So it's beautiful to see.
Super exciting.
We do have an audience question. It's for Stephanie. They asked, if you were to design a flag for the U.S. today, how would it? Let's see. Now I can't read because it's live. How would it look? What would the flag symbolize, and what message would you like the flag to carry?
Oof. Wow, that is
And that's a big question, right?
yeah, that's a lot of weight. I would probably, as a designated conceptual artist, I would probably have the flag change every week, and it would be designed by a different person every week.
Mm.
That's not an answer, I know, but it's, in other words, it's to stop it from sort of like hardening.
Yeah.
The flag itself, is like it's I think as a symbol, it gets owned by groups of people that then, you can't really escape that meaning. And I know it also shifts generationally, right? Like, I think sometimes it becomes more nationalistic than at other times, but we could also argue it's always nationalistic. I don't know. That's a tough one. Yeah. Thanks for
I
asking.
love that you said that too, because I've also, this isn't necessarily about the American flag, but there's plenty of people who have done this before, but I've always wanted to do a project commissioning artists to just make flags, and like just to have like a rotating, and maybe I'll be able to do that at the Upton Mansion. We have a flagpole there. So.
Yeah. It's hard to make that more democratic, I guess, the flag, it would be good too.
I had another question for you, for Savannah. I'm curious to hear a little bit about what are you working on, for the future? What's coming up next for you?
There's a lot. I moved back to Baltimore from California specifically to work with the Afro Archives, and it's completely overwhelming. Like, I'll just say that up front. It's a huge amount of material, but I'm really hoping to raise enough money to be able to digitize the full photo collection, which initially we estimated at about 1 million photographs. But I recently talked to a former archivist and she was like, where'd you get that number? I thought it was closer to 4 million. So now it's like, oh, okay, great.
Changes the game.
It changes things to a certain degree. But it's also, I think once you get started, once you have the mechanisms in place, it doesn't really matter how big the number is, because we'll keep it going. It's been 128 years that this newspaper has existed. So we have a track record for longevity. So as long as we can get the setup going, I think it'll be all right. So working on the planning process for that right now. And then really an exciting project is that the Afro and Afro Charities, which is a nonprofit partner to the Afro, which I'm actually executive director of, is we're redeveloping a historic piece of property in West Baltimore called the Upton Mansion, which the city has owned for the past several years. And it'll be the new headquarters for the Afro. The archives will live there, and then there will also be space available for like-minded businesses to rent out, and as well as a community room. So we're just getting started on that now. There's an archaeology study underway that University of Maryland is spearheading, and hopefully we won't find any human remains, because that would slow the process down significantly. And so we'll see what we find and keep it moving. But those are two of the big projects that I'm working on right now.
Awesome. Stephanie, I had it.
Sorry, go on.
What were you going to say?
I was going to ask Savannah, what percentage of the archive is digitized now? Like, when you're talking 4 million, I'm just so curious, because I'm rummaging through so many archives myself. Like, what?
That's a good question. We did a project a few years ago with Johns Hopkins, and there was a student in that project who developed this robotic arm that would lift the images and scan them. and so he was able to digitize about 12,000 photos. Actually, maybe a bit more than that, but there's about 12,000 photos that are available for licensing on Getty Images through that project. But when you look at the grand scheme of the full collections, it's kind of minuscule. But the cool thing about our collection, which most other places don't have, is that because it was for a newspaper, the captions are actually on the back of each image. And so there's just this huge amount of information about who's in the images, what the event was, what the date was, what city it was in. So, people often call looking for their aunts, their grandmothers, that sort of thing, because there's so many families represented in this collection, so it's pretty wild, super important.
Wow.
Oh, so if anybody wants to help out and support, go to afrocharities.org/donate, and I'll put it in the chat.
We actually have a middle school art teacher in the comments, and she's saying that she's gonna, what did she say? She says she's gonna make the flag a feedback project for her class.
Oh, that's great.
which I think is pretty awesome. It kind of, I want you to talk a little bit, Stephanie, about process. Like there's that, the fabric, the pixelated fabric that you use to cover the sculptures. I'm curious a little bit about the process. Like, how does that come to be? What does your process look like?
Yeah. No, thanks for asking. I mean, it's funny because that particular work is actually, it's digitally produced. So I work with a digital fabric printer to, literally take a digital file and then put it on there, which kind of makes sense, right? Because it is a referencing like a digital editing process. But a lot of my work is actually handmade, so I've done these larger sort of textile related projects where I'm literally, crafting 19th century or Civil War era, like bonnets and ribbons, all this other stuff to, again, kind of pick apart the fabrication of history. So I shift a lot between, kind of like, I guess, digital production or, outsourcing of production and then the handmade. Because it turns out actually, so the flags that are all hanging in the rotunda, I worked with a company that is based in New England, which is one of the like premier kind of like applique flag makers in the United States. They're one of the last like fully handmade flag companies. And so I wanted to work with them actually because of that history, because they make American flags all day.
Right.
And so let's have you make these weird fictional, foreign flags instead.
That is awesome. So Stephanie, what are you working on in terms of like, what do you have coming up?
Oh, God, what am I doing? The next project is for the Arizona State University Museum, looking again at ethnographic photography from the Smithsonian. And I have to say, it's a lot of like psychic, intensity. Yeah. So, you just go through hundreds and hundreds of images. And what I'm doing now is I'm erasing them. So, I get the images that have these like pretty, I would say standard, kind of almost like mugshot images of native folks, from the Philippines. And I erase them. I use Photoshop to erase them. So you're left with a kind of like a blur or a shadow or a remnant. And it's part of my way also of kind of almost like releasing them from the archive. Because, part of the history of photography is that it was also a way to kind of encapsulate or create a, pretty racist visual story of people. And these went on, these were generated over 100 years ago, and they've gone on to keep informing, really, even contemporary visions of non-white folks. So I wish it were lighter, but
Can't always be light.
I guess so. But thanks for asking, Tracy.
Let's see, we got about 2 minutes left. I think we have a few comments here. I'm trying to choose between this question that I'm burning to ask Savannah and reading a couple comments. There's being selfish. There is that last photo that you showed, Savannah. It was your silhouette over an ancestor's photo. I'm just curious, did that just sort of happen and you were like, I need to capture that, or kind of, yeah, did you sort of like?
Well, it was staged. I mean, that was at my grandma's house, and I was walking down I think I was like in this room one day, and I just was like, oh wow, that's interesting, and I noticed it. And so at a later date, or it might have even been later that day, I just, Black grandmother's house, there's like a whole hallway of ancestors, right? So I'm like, I'm sorry everybody, but I had to take you all off the wall so that I could just focus in on this one photograph. So I took everybody off the wall except for this one image that was already hung in that position, and then set a camera up and photographed it from the room looking into the hallway. So, I also often will use in photographs like door frames and reflections sort of as like visual metaphors for moving between different planes of existence, crossing thresholds, reflecting yourself back to yourself through these other images, finding a closeness with history and intimacy with history. So all of those things are kind of tied into it. But yeah, it was sort of just something I noticed and then reconstructed.
Thanks for sharing that. And well, it's 7 o'clock. I don't want to let you go, but we have to. But I want to thank you both for being here. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Savannah. I want to thank Jessica Bell Brown and Leila Grothe. Also want to thank Andrea Boston, who is our woman behind the curtain, making all this happen. And obviously, thank all of you for tuning in this evening. Continue to follow the Baltimore Museum of Art on Instagram, on Facebook, and of course, you can log on to our website as well. So have a good evening and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.